You're watching Force 13's live streaming service.
Good afternoon, this is Force 13 Live. We are live tracking Hurricane Lee and Hurricane Margot in the Atlantic, the latter of which, talking about Lee, is sparking hurricane watches for portions of New England and Atlantic Canada. Right now, there is a hurricane watch in effect from Stonington, Maine to the US-Canada border, from New Brunswick from the US-Canada border to Point Lepreau, including Grand Manan Island, and for Nova Scotia from Digby to Midway Harbor. My name is Ethan Bruning, and I am joined by my live team consisting of a few people here. I know that we also have Christian, we have Patrick, we have Chris, we have Marlene, and I believe that's about all we have on our live team consisting of tonight. How are you guys all doing? We also have Josh with us as well.
We're good.
Doing fine.
A-okay.
Just to reiterate, there is a hurricane watch in effect from Stonington, Maine to the US-Canada border, New Brunswick from the US-Canada border to Point Lepreau, including Grand Manan Island, and from Nova Scotia from Digby to Midway Harbor. There is also a tropical storm warning in effect for the island of Bermuda, Westport, Massachusetts, northward to the US-Canada border, including the city of Boston, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. There is also a tropical storm watch in effect for New Brunswick from north of Point Lepreau to Fort Lawrence, Nova Scotia west coast from north of Digby to Fort Lawrence, and Nova Scotia southeast coast from north of Midway Harbor to Point Tupper. A hurricane watch means that hurricane conditions are possible within the watch area. A watch is typically issued around 48 hours before the anticipated first occurrence of tropical storm force winds, conditions that make outside preparations difficult or dangerous. Bottom line, this hurricane is coming, and the preparation should be beginning in earnest. If you have any comments or questions, you can send those down to the comment section down below. And we've already got one. Will Connecticut get tropical storm force winds from Hurricane Lee? It's hard to say. I think Connecticut just might be just a little bit too far west for this storm. But I think generally Providence northward along Interstate 95, maybe even a little bit westward of that. I'm trying to think of like a highway that goes northward from Boston directly. Areas east of there will be the most likely area to get tropical storm force winds. So Patrick, I see that you've got some imagery up on Lee right now. What are you seeing on satellite of this very large hurricane?
Well, two things to point out here. Number one is that Lee is looking a little bit less impressive in terms of its satellite appearance. In terms of deep convection, it appears to have devoided pretty much all of its deep convection that it has been standing for quite a while. I'm going to try and pull up the infrared. I'll go back to tropical tidbits and pull up some infrared imagery here real quick. As you can see right now, Lee is still a large and powerful hurricane. It currently is packing winds of 85 miles per hour, though we here at Force 13 are running a little bit conservative with 80. Still has a very intense pressure for this wind speeds of a hurricane, 957 millibars. You can see that it doesn't have a lot of deep convection near its center. It is definitely looking a little bit more elongated on the western side, a very large, and I mean very large and expansive wind field. You can also tell on satellite and infrared how the storm is pretty much expanding in size, which is probably also going to contribute why the impacts are going to be spreading out way far from the center, which is really crucial that you need to be keeping an eye on this system, because regardless of where you are, there are likely to be potentially significant impacts that will extend well away from the center, given the fact that Lee is such a large and powerful storm. While it doesn't look too impressive right now in terms of having more robust convection near the center, it definitely is a large and powerful system and needs to be watched very closely.
I just want to point out that 80 miles an hour on that bottom bar is actually a typo. It is supposed to say 85. I just now realized that. So my apologies on that. I just want us to real quick go over to the latest National Hurricane Center's forecast cone. Right now, the storm is located around 185 miles west of Bermuda, if you're tracking it at home, 32.1 north, 68.0 degrees west. And you'll notice here that Lee is forecast to gradually weaken as it pushes off towards the north here. But you'll notice here, before it reaches land, it is forecast to be a post-tropical cyclone. Now, I don't want to alert anybody or concern everybody that, hey, because the storm's going to be post-tropical, doesn't mean that it's going to be a bad storm. No, that does not mean the case at all. You saw back last year, we had Fiona hit Atlantic Canada as a post-tropical cyclone, and look at how bad that was. So just because that this is going to be turning into a post-tropical cyclone, and a large one at that, going to be getting even bigger than what it is now, coming into land does not mean that the threat for this storm is going to go down at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impacts will extend far away from the center, given the fact that the wind field is also going to be continuing to expand, and also given the fact that a high tide cycle is also going to be kicking in when the storm nears the United States and Atlantic Canada. Anywhere from the United States Canadian border through Boston Harbor, Cape Cod, Nantucket. Even if you are along the south shores of Long Island, Rockaways, Long Island Sound, down towards New York City, southern New York City beaches, you are going to be feeling the effects of this storm. The most likely effects from the storm, the further south you go, is likely going to be dangerous surf, life-threatening rip currents, as well as storm surge, given the fact that this system is actually going to be quite a large system and the high tide cycle is actually going to be aggravating this storm surge effect and could bring upwards of 1 to 2 feet of storm surge along the southern south shores of Long Island, including the Long Island Sound. However, the greater you go northward, where Lee is going to be making its closest pass, it is likely to bring more significant storm surge. Although storm surge is not expected to be that significant, it definitely could be minor to moderate, although the further north you go, the greatest confidence on potentially moderate storm surge is going to be present as you get up towards Boston Harbor and up towards the United States-Canadian border.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that you've got that storm surge graphic up on your screen. We'll pull it up here. There it is. So storm surge, while you might be thinking 1 to 3 feet isn't really going to be that big, it's particularly interesting to see just how far west those storm surge values goes, almost into downtown New York City, getting close to Manhattan there.
Yeah, absolutely. You could see there basically right along the Rockaway Inlet, basically just south of New York Harbor, including the area near the JFK Airport, basically along the southern basically along the entirety of the Rockaway Peninsula, eastward towards the southern Nassau beaches, including also the Twin Forks, southern Long Island beaches, including the Long Island Sound. You could see there 1 to 2 feet of storm surge, perhaps even greater within the Long Island Sound. So, this is pretty much just a sign that this storm is going to be having its impacts felt across a wide scale. And given the fact that it is a large system, it doesn't mean that you cannot keep your guard down, even if you're in the area stretching around New York City, including also upwards towards like areas near Boston, Martha's Vineyard. As the further west you go, you still are going to have the potential for dangerous, life-threatening surf, as well as rip currents and potentially storm surge, which could be aggravated a little bit by the high tide cycle, like I've been pointing out. We'll have to see what that does to really play a factor into this particular storm surge potential. However, regardless, still keep an eye out on this storm, regardless of where you are, from basically the southern New York City beaches all the way up towards the U.S.-Canadian border, as it definitely is going to be very interesting to see what this storm brings to the area. It definitely will be a very cloudy day. Not really going to be seeing rainfall the further west you go. However, you definitely will be seeing some definitely some cloudy conditions with some high latitude clouds that will overspread as Lee basically continues to expand its wind field and moisture axis.
Absolutely. Someone is asking us, will coastal Rhode Island get hurricane force conditions? So let's go to the National Hurricane Center's forecasted wind fields. I'll pull it up here. Where is it? There it is. So here is the forecasted wind fields, and just to reiterate, the purple area that I'm circling here, these are your forecasted hurricane force wind fields. The purple dashed out line, that is your 60-mile-an-hour plus wind field. And then, of course, the largest circle is your tropical storm conditions. So you can see here, those conditions at maximum, if you were to draw a westward cone, so to speak, of how far west these go, it'd only be something just like that. So maybe just barely clipping eastern Rhode Island, certainly going through maybe parts of Boston a little bit. But coastal Rhode Island, it's a bit hard to say if you're going to get hurricane force conditions. Of course, if Lee does go on the western end of this forecast cone and comes up riding the western end of this, which it probably won't, the hurricane force gusts certainly could potentially happen, but sustained hurricane force winds at this point are unlikely. Max, I would say, sustained winds for Rhode Island at this point that Lee could produce, it's probably going to be around 45 to 50 miles an hour, not to be very much in terms of winds in Rhode Island. But the biggest threat is going to be just how I guess you could say how long duration this is going to be. This isn't going to be something like I remember last year or a few years ago we had I forget what was that storm's name, Henri, I think is what it was.
Henri, yes.
Yeah. That was a tropical storm that came up in Rhode Island and sort of stalled over southern New England here and produced rainfall. We're not going to be having a situation like that. This is going to be moving very quickly, and conditions are going to be just basically a few hours at most in terms of tropical storm force winds, maybe even a little bit longer than that. But this is not going to be a long duration event, so I don't really think that things will be too bad for New England here. If you have any comments or questions, you can tell them down in the comment section down below. One of our contributors is asking, is Long Island in the clear from Lee? I noticed that 1 to 3 feet of storm surge is expected for the Long Island Sound, and storm surge is expected as far west as Flushing, Queens, and the Rockaways. As far as storm surge, I think New England, Long Island, I should say, is in the clear at this point. You might get some gusty winds at times, but overall, I don't think that things are going to be too bad for us here on Long Island. And I know that you're in Long Island, right, Patrick? So you can give a personal opinion on that if you'd like.
So I will say that the storm surge potential across Long Island, including the southern New York City and New York beaches, isn't going to be entirely impossible slash 0%. It is definitely going to be a low chance. However, it definitely is going to pretty much it really is going to depend on how further west Lee is going to bank. However, most models, including the current trends for Lee, have this particular system really banking towards the east as it accelerates northward and then making that sharp leftward yank before doing a little bit of a wobble in the Gulf of Maine and then pretty much slamming directly into the United States-Canadian border. Right now, based off of the latest National Hurricane Center forecast cone, this storm is likely to, like I said, do a little bit of a wobble. It will accelerate northward into the Gulf of Maine, right off the coast of Nova Scotia, and then it will likely make some sort of a northwestward wobble and then a trajectory back to the east, northeast, or northeast. There is a little bit of uncertainty on if this will be making potentially, I believe the NHC, if I look at their forecast cone right now, NHC for the time being is actually forecasting the potential for not just one, but potentially, if the center does stay over water, obviously we're gonna have to wait and see on that. But it does have it making its close past Nova Scotia by around 2 p.m. Saturday before potentially making yet another landfall, perhaps even right along the northwestern fringe of Nova Scotia into Newfoundland and Labrador. And then it'll be obviously making a transition off to the northeast, and we'll be heading off towards areas south of Greenland and making its way out of our hair, and will likely be seizing its impacts as it gets past that point.
Absolutely. Alongside Lee, we do have a few more tropical cyclones out here in the Atlantic Basin. We have Margot. Here is the forecast cone on Margot. Forecast to sort of meander around, I guess you could say, in the Atlantic, west of the Azores, and generally die off heading into the middle of next week. Good thing is this storm is not a threat to land. We also do have Invest Area 97L here down in the deep tropical Atlantic. National Hurricane Center right now is giving this system a 90% chance of tropical cyclone development in the next 48 hours. So I think that this will become a tropical cyclone pretty soon. It's a bit hard to say where it goes beyond this point, but model guidance at this point does take the storm out to sea, thankfully. As this is our normal tropical weather bulletin hour, we'll be having the models here in just about maybe 15 to 20 minutes or so. So stay tuned. We'll see what the models, particularly the GFS one, has to say about this system, and including Invest 94E here in the Eastern Pacific, which might be our next shot at potentially getting the name Hone. I don't think it's going to happen, though, unfortunately.
Oh,
No,
please.
no, it's not.
Hello, Ethan.
Ethan's the one
Well,
hosting.
if you do have any comments section down in the question in the comment section down below, be sure to tag us at 413. It'll light up nice and bright and orange for me to read those. Is Lee going to make landfall as a tropical or post-tropical cyclone? As it is forecasted right now, Lee is going to make landfall clearly as a post-tropical cyclone. Although there is a bit of a question, when does this post-tropical transition occur? Does it occur a little bit earlier than forecast? Does it occur a little bit later than forecast? There is still some wiggle room on that. But I think that the general timing is sometime midday on Saturday, maybe into Saturday afternoon, right as it's sort of getting close to that southwestern tip of Nova Scotia, I think is the general forecasting time for when this turns post-tropical. So if I had to make a personal forecast, I would probably agree with the National Hurricane Center and say a post-tropical landfall is inbound. And do we also think that the name Lee will get retired? I think it's a little bit too early to ask that. We'll have to wait and see after Lee makes its impact felt in Canada and New England. But personally, I don't think things are going to be too bad here for land impacts from Lee. Most of these areas have dealt with way worse than this. If you have any comments, be sure to once again tag us at 413 in the comment section down below. It'll light up nice and bright and orange for us. We're also joined now from, I believe, in the Philippines is Nathan. Hello.
Good morning. Just after 8 a.m. here, a beautiful hot morning. And the Philippines, being the typhoon capital of the world, shows no sign of a typhoon anywhere. And as I've been listening to you in the last 10 minutes or so talking all about Lee, well, that is where it's at right now, with Lee being the major threat. Although I must say, Ethan, I'm not really surprised to see now that they are expecting a post-tropical landfall. I was never completely sold on that tropical landfall in the first place, to be honest. To my understanding, is it weaker than expected at this point?
Yes, I think it is, just by a little bit. So there is a slight chance that this might go into its post-tropical phase, maybe as a strong tropical storm, or maybe it weakens down into tropical storm status as it turns post-tropical, or it could become a post-tropical hurricane force system and then weaken down below hurricane force as a post-tropical cyclone. There's still a lot of question marks with when this post-tropical transition occurs and at what intensity.
I had a quick look at satellite imagery, and it's really starting to sprawl a little bit with all of that banding and rainfall.
Yes, it is. It is starting to unravel itself as it turns further north. I'll do the best I can. WSV3 isn't wanting to cooperate with me today, unfortunately, but you can see just how far the influence goes of this storm right now. If you were to consider its influence, it's already going up well into northern Canada, it looks like. Already, which is quite remarkable.
A very impressive storm by all counts, really, and a quite long life. How long has it lived now?
Let's see. I can get the best track. So it looks like
time.
that.
It's been a while.
11 days.
Yeah, so on the UTC clock, we're actually entering what looks to be day 10 or 11. It formed back in the early morning hours around 11 a.m. Eastern on the 5th of September. So whatever number you want to go by then, 10 or 11.
It's the 15th over in UTC right now, so I'd say 10.
Either way, clearly a very long-lived hurricane. And it is, I will say, it is really good that this storm is a lot weaker than forecast. Because I remember whenever it was making this turn, as Lee was speaking as a Category 5 hurricane a few days ago, it was forecast to be a significant major hurricane at this point. And here we are looking at a 85 miles an hour Category 1 hurricane at this point. So thankfully, it's weakened a lot more than forecast. I think part of that is due to the cold pools of both Franklin and Idalia that it's currently over right now. So that's good that those storms have occurred in the past few weeks.
Not to mention the earlier.
I'm not going to. Sorry, Nathan. The point. I just want to quickly bring us in real quick. Ethan, if you take a look at imagery, I'm actually not surprised to even make a claim that the extratropical transition is already beginning. Lee is devoiding of its very deep convection that we've previously seen across its entire lifespan. It appears to be amassing a very large rain shield and this very large area of banding, basically expanding northward with the basically the orientation of Lee's structure right now leads me to believe that it already is beginning to turn post-tropical. We don't know that for sure. There is recon actually in Lee right now, currently investigating the storm, but I won't be surprised if this does get designated or gets designated post-tropical, or likely is making that turn right now. It doesn't look as robust as that, as I pointed out in the center, and I may already be beginning its post-tropical cyclone transition as we speak. I mean, we really don't know for sure, but it definitely has got that look.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit. I think that Lee is going through at the moment a very, very, very slow weakening process and a very slow post-tropical transition at that. So I think any sort of weakening rate or post-tropical transition with Lee is likely to be very slow. And it would not surprise me if it's already been doing this post-tropical transition now for the better part of maybe a day or so now. It's been a very slow process and will continue to be for the next 24 to 36 hours. But it's going to really speed up as this hurricane gets more north. Thinking Saturday into Saturday, midday Saturday is when we're really going to be see that weakening rate and that post-tropical transition increase in terms of the rate of that.
Yeah, there will be a frontal system that does catch up to Lee, and basically will be accelerating it northward. However, regardless of it being extratropical, post-tropical, or not, this is going to be a significant storm. Regardless of it being post-tropical or whatnot, it's still going to have potentially significant impacts given how large the system is, as well as how far the wind field is and how it could potentially spread impacts from as far north as the United States-Canadian border, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, all the way into potentially Boston Harbor down towards southern New England.
Absolutely. Marlene, I know that you're in Canada. What is your official agency right now urging people to do in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, I think is what the province is there?
Yes, just a second. I'm just pulling up the tropical cyclone report.
Okay, that's fine.
Tropical cyclone
Ethan?
information statement in effect for central and southwestern Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, where Hurricane Lee moving into western Nova Scotia, southern New Brunswick Saturday with heavy rains, high winds, and large waves, then weakening quickly Saturday night with lingering conditions on Sunday.
So basically, they're just reiterating what the National Hurricane Center is saying. That's really good that they both have agreement on that. And preparations for the storm need to begin now, if not already. Preparations should be completing, I imagine, sometime midday on Saturday. Lee is going to be a very large storm whenever it makes landfall in Canada. And we'll have a look here at the earliest onset of tropical storm force winds. The earliest reasonable for Nova Scotia looks to be maybe Friday night, maybe tomorrow night, around maybe 10 p.m., 9 p.m., around that time frame for the southern tip of Nova Scotia. Of course, you got over here down in New England, you got the earliest reasonable is probably going to be midday tomorrow into the early afternoon hours for tropical storm force winds along the southeastern coast of New England. So this storm is coming, and preparation should be beginning, if not already underway, in most of these locations. Nathan, you wanted to say something?
For
Nathan's not.
Atlantic coastal
Nathan
Nova
is
Scotia, breaking waves
not
of
hearing
4
you.
to 6 meters or 15 to 20 feet are likely. Elevated water levels combined with waves could result in coastal flooding during the high tide late morning to noon Saturday in Shelburne County, and then during the high tide late Saturday evening along the coast from Queens County to eastern Halifax County. It is during this late Saturday period where a storm surge warning may be required. Water levels up to 1 meter or 3 feet above high tide is possible.
Interesting question here. Do we think that Lee is going to be moving how fast Fiona was whenever it was coming into Canada? I don't think it's going to be moving that fast, maybe a little bit slower, but certainly Lee is not going to be linking over an area. It's going to be moving very quickly off towards the northeast, particularly, especially as you get into late Sunday into Monday. That movement vector off towards the northeast, passing over northern Newfoundland, is really going to increase as the storm heads off into the northern Atlantic, as most tropical post-tropical cyclones do in this time of the year for post-tropical hurricanes.
We do have a little bit of recon data coming in right now from AF304, low-level reconnaissance mission 33. As of right now, they have dropped a sonde. I don't know where they have dropped the sonde. However, they have a 984 millibar sonde with a north-northwest wind at 77 knots. This is an unknown location right now, and you can also see on this data wind field that they are finding some pretty strong flight level winds in the southwestern quadrant. And it appears that they are now even going for a southwest to northeast pass. I already know that they did drop a sonde and found 956. However, they are currently investigating the storm right now. Southwestern, I would honestly not even say the southwestern side. This really doesn't even have a really well-defined eye wall, so all I'm going to say is just southwestern quadrant of the storm right now in terms of flight level winds, and this will be making a southwest northeast pass, looks like, and could be potentially sampling areas near the center. We'll have to wait and see what they find in terms of pressure data, if Lee's pressure is rising or holding steady or even perhaps dropping, as Lee has a very impressive pressure for where it currently is right now, which just shows that this is an intense hurricane, regardless of it being Category 1 status.
Absolutely. Interesting question. Do you think that the Atlantic has overperformed this year, given that El Nino normally suppresses activity in the Atlantic? Well, personally, I think that's because the Atlantic overall has had above average sea surface temperatures since the beginning this year. And I think that sort of has contributed to the recent tropical cyclone activity we've seen, beginning with I forget what the E name is, beginning with Emily and Franklin, and of course now it's continuing through 97L. And I think that might continue for another week or two, but it's hard to say exactly how long it will last for. But the general rule of thumb here, as we move into mid to late September and into October, it does appear that the average area or the most favorable area for tropical cyclone development might move closer to Mexico. We're thinking maybe the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and especially over there in the Eastern Pacific. I think those regions are going to be very favorable for tropical cyclone development heading into October. And we're going to need to watch that Western Caribbean area very closely, as we normally need to in October, as ocean heat content, particularly in the Western Caribbean, is simply off the charts, as it has been over the past few years.
Indeed,
Little
Ethan,
bit of-
I'll go ahead and comment on that real quick. The activity of the Atlantic so far. Philip Klotzbach, who's a meteorologist at Colorado State University, specializes in Atlantic Basin hurricanes, actually tweeted out about 4:20 p.m. Central today that the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season has already eclipsed the 100 accumulated cyclone energy mark. 7 other years in the satellite era since 1966 have only 7 others have reached it by September 14th, and that was 1995, 1996, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2008, and 2017. So even with it being an El Nino year, we're witnessing something pretty historic with the way the season's gone so far.
We do have a little bit of interesting breaking news coming out of Bermuda. As of the latest update here from poweroutage.us, 7,100 people are currently out without power in Bermuda. I think that was a little bit important to share there. As Bermuda has been experiencing tropical storm not necessarily hurricane conditions, although I was hearing rumors that there was potentially hurricane force wind gusts potentially measured near Bermuda. However, tropical storm conditions have been impacting Bermuda throughout the entirety of the day today. Likely will continue for the next 12 to 24 hours, perhaps even a little bit longer than that. Before Lee will rapidly accelerate northward. However, power outages are on the rise in Bermuda right now. And I definitely think that number could rise as we head into the evening to overnight period and into the latter half of the day tomorrow.
Just want to point out I'm currently generating the 18Z GFS, so in just a minute or two we will be going to the model runs. So if you do have any last second questions before we go over to the model runs, please send them to the conversation down below. More of a climatologically one here. Do we think August will have more storms than September will be? Since right now September has only spawned basically 3 tropical cyclones here in the Atlantic, or do you think that it might spike late month? Personally, I think maybe the Atlantic might get one more named storm after 97L throughout the month of September, but it's a bit too early to say for sure what exactly will happen. I think it's certainly interesting, but I don't think September is going to pass August activity. I think that activity was simply remarkable, what we saw in August in the Atlantic.
Yeah, we're likely going to be seeing the transition. The upper air and mid-level climatological patterns are definitely going to be switching, although we're still in an El Nino. I believe the latest forecasts are for us to transition out of an El Nino, potentially back into a La Nina within the next 6 months. However, the Atlantic should quiet down after 97L, like Ethan said, and definitely will be interesting to see if more storms come out of this already pretty average to perhaps even above average season in terms of the pretty interesting activity we've had this entire season. Go for it, Ethan.
Right, the GFS is ready. Shall we go to the model runs here? Let's see what the 18Z GFS is cooking up here in the Atlantic. Regarding Lee here, let's see what the GFS initializes it as. It's got initializing it as a fairly strong storm here. Looks to be maybe even getting up towards low category 2, 95 miles an hour max there. Obviously, we know it's weaker than that. So it is initializing it just a little bit too strong. But you can see here, it does move Lee very quickly off towards the north. I'm a bit curious to see if it does keep it on the forecast track of the National Hurricane Center's forecast cone. I'm trying to get it up on there, and it's not wanting to cooperate with me. Okay, cool. That's just nice. But anyway, you can see the GFS does keep it maybe a little bit east of the forecast cone initially, but then sort of shifts it back off towards the west, and these are the kind of things that we're going to need to watch for as Lee comes in, is these wobbles. You know, does it wobble a little bit off towards the west? Does it wobble a little bit off towards the east? We'll have to wait and see on that, where it exactly wobbles. But looks like that it might come into the bay here, making landfall quite quickly on southwestern Nova Scotia, and as it moves inland, it weakens quite considerably and pushes rapidly off towards the northeast. And heading into next week, it looks like that it becomes sort of really elongated, as it simply does off in the northern Atlantic. Quick question here: do you think Lee will make landfall in Maine or in Canada? Personally, I think the Canada landfall is much more likely than Maine. Do we think Hurricane Lee will change its direction before it strikes land? We don't, unfortunately. It's going to be curving very slowly from a northerly direction to a northeasterly direction very slowly as it comes on in. And any surf parties in Nova Scotia on Saturday, I don't know. You'd have to probably check around in the communities around there. Going back to the 18Z GFS, it has Margot, barely as a hurricane, it looks like. Let's see what it has for Margot. Maybe around its current intensity, maybe 77 miles an hour max winds. Oh, there's 78. So it's got its intensity around what it is now. although the GFS does sort of meander it, it does go way farther south than what the National Hurricane Center has the forecasted track going, and looping very quickly, and interestingly becoming, or still having strong tropical storm force winds as it turns post-tropical here. I imagine it'll either turn post-tropical or become a remnant low as it moves off towards the northeast here, passing north of the Azores and gradually weakening as it heads off into next weekend. So that's what we're seeing with Margot. Now let's see what it has with 97L. Here is the general area of vorticity that 97L is right now. What do we all think it's going to do here before I show it? Lots from the team.
Major.
This is likely to be and I will quickly point out before I throw it over to the rest of the team here and you, Ethan. 97L, to put it into simplest terms, is likely to be a potentially significant tropical cyclone, could potentially reach above Category 1 status. I know most intensity ensembles are bringing this up to Cat 2 right now, but we'll have to see what the good old GFS decides to print out for this potential tropical cyclone, which could be designated as early as maybe even 3Z or perhaps even tomorrow by 9Z.
I think the most likely time for formation is probably going to be this weekend. I don't think it's going to form tomorrow, personally. But let's see what the GFS says about it. It becomes a tropical storm, what looks to be maybe on the 16th, so that would be Saturday. Moves rapidly off towards the northwest. Look at how far away from land it is compared to Lee's track, though. Here's Lee's track, here's Margot's, sort of taking the in-between track initially. A fairly large tropical cyclone, has to be said here, and does become a pretty strong hurricane here. That looks to be maybe, that is indeed a low-end major hurricane there. Certainly we'll probably get to it later on in this run, if I had to guess. Yep, there's certainly a major hurricane, yep. 117 mile an hour, 118 mile an hour sustained winds there, so that is a mid Cat 3. Would not surprise me if that's up towards Category 4. This is just a model run. This is not a an exact forecast, but you can see here the GFS does take this system far harmlessly away from any land areas. Just for reference, let's circle Bermuda here. There's Bermuda. Does not get tropical storm force wind. It's a very close call. But you can see here the system, after it passes by Bermuda off towards the east, look at where it goes. Harmlessly out to sea. This is what we want to see. What the heck is that? Turning off towards the northwest right there at the last minute. I imagine that's probably turning post-tropical there, remaining far offshore and turning post-tropical. So this does not appear like this is going to affect any land areas over the foreseeable future. We'll see what the forecasted models have for this system. And that doesn't even have 97L. That's just fantastic. So that's great. So that's what it's saying on 97L. Lee moving into Atlantic Canada as a strong system, turning post-tropical. Margot going to meander here, and 97L probably going to recurve out to sea. So that's what the 18Z GFS is saying in the Atlantic. So I think that's very interesting to see that model run. We'll go over here to the Eastern Pacific. Here is 94E, what we're seeing here. Going back to the GFS run here, it does develop it into a rather compact tropical cyclone initially, and does not sustain its intensity for very long thanks to high amounts of wind shear in the area, and will weaken as we head into early next week. This is going to be a very short-lived storm, but the question is, there's still a lot riding on the line with this. Does it get the name Hone, or does it get the name Kenneth, and end the major hurricane streak that the name Kenneth has? Fun fact, every single usage of the name Kenneth so far in the Eastern Pacific has been a major hurricane. And if this usage of the name Kenneth does not get to major hurricane status, which I don't see if it, I don't really see it getting to major hurricane status, let alone hurricane status, if it does end up getting the name Kenneth, does that record break? We'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of things riding on the line with this system, and we'll have to continue to monitor the system closely. For the rest of the model run here, I'll let it play out here. I don't think it's going to have anything else here in the basin. Maybe something forming there. Oh, that's a significant tropical cyclone. That looks to be towards the middle to late part of next week. Maybe something here forming in the Eastern Pacific, heading out to sea. That's pretty typical for this time of year, and I don't think that's the only thing GFS has. Maybe something forming right at the end of the run here in the ultra long range area, close to the coastline of Mexico as we get towards October. This is what I've been saying here. As we get close to October, watch this part of the Eastern Pacific for tropical cyclone development. I think it's going to become pretty favorable here in the eastern part of the basin. Into the Western Pacific, I hate to disappoint people here. I don't think there's going to be anything here. We'll check the model run here. There's 93W moving off. 92W near Taiwan sort of dies off. Still nothing here as we enter the middle of next week. Something tries to form to the east of Luzon, doesn't really end up forming eventually. It does end up becoming something. It looks like towards the end of the model run here as it pushes off towards the west. This is long range, so things can change here in the Western Pacific. Does become a typhoon, looks like a fairly compact one, moving over areas that were affected previously by Typhoon Saola. Fairly compact Category 2 storm at this point. This is long range once again, moving off really fairly quickly, has to be said, off towards the west into the South China Sea and moving off towards the west south of Hong Kong. That's what GFS has in the Western Pacific. Maybe a few frontal systems forming out here, maybe brief tropical cyclones out here in the eastern part of the basin. This is normal for this time of year. But anything really out this far here in the Western Pacific is low confidence. But you'll notice here, for a good chunk of the forecast period here in the Western Pacific, nothing forms here until maybe the middle part of next week. So we'll continue to monitor the Western Pacific into next week very closely. I know that we just had a invest here in the Bay of Bengal that has moved quickly inland. I don't think the GFS has anything forming here in the Indian Ocean. No, nothing here. And we'll check the southern hemispheres here because why not? Because we're bored here. Nothing here in the southern hemisphere in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific. I don't think there's going to be anything here, thanks to the fairly off season. Yeah, for the usual wintertime stuff down here in the post-tropics. So that's what the 18Z GFS is saying for our systems right now. Thoughts from the team on that? Certainly an interesting model run and a very quiet scene that we're witnessing across the Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific.
I'm not surprised on 94E's initialization because it is going to be dealing with some very poor upper level environmental conditions as it further heads out into the its lifespan here. It is definitely not going to be a long-lived storm. However, as you said, Ethan, the question remains, if it goes past the 140 degree west line, are we going to finally get the Hone name, or are we going to get Kenneth? We're likely to see a record break regardless of the name, as you said there, with every single usage of Kenneth being with a major hurricane. That record could likely fall or break, or the streak, if you want to even call it that. But still, definitely a lot of things riding on for Invest 94E in terms of its basically where it's designated, where it basically officially establishes itself, and where it goes. Now, for Lee, I'm obviously not surprised on the guidance there from GFS. The GFS has pretty much been banking upon what the NHC is currently indicating, basically a northward acceleration, a little bit of a northwest or perhaps even due northerly wobble, and then making a sharp northeast curve into Atlantic Canada, perhaps even the United States East Coast. And there definitely will be impacts felt across a wide scale. I do want to quickly point out here that there is a slight risk out for excessive rainfall for eastern Maine. This is in association with Hurricane Lee. There also exists a marginal risk stretching from Martha's Vineyard up the Boston Harbor, and also does include areas stretching into Atlantic Canada. This is in association with Lee. I will zoom in on it and not focus on the Texas flash flooding risk, but we can look at Maine as well as basically the far eastern extents of southern New England here. You can see there a large and broad slight risk pretty much extends across eastern Maine, also does include portions of Atlantic Canada, although we are going to be heading into the Canadian Weather Service territory here, so there really is no official flooding risk for Canada that we can view on the NWS side of things. However, definitely flash flooding will be a threat, as well as coastal flooding, specifically across Maine as well as Atlantic Canada. However, coastal flooding could be potentially felt as far south as areas of Long Island, including the southern New York City beaches, where coastal flood advisories are currently out for the potential of minor coastal flooding across a large swath of southern New England up towards Atlantic Canada.
Absolutely. If you do have any comments or questions, send them down to the comment section down below. Personally, regarding 94E, I think that the record of Kenneth's major hurricane streak is about to end. I really don't see this becoming a tropical storm, or I really don't see this not becoming a tropical storm prior to the Central Pacific, unfortunately. So that is going to be one record that is going to be unfortunately broken with this season.
I mean, you can never discount any possibility, but yeah, definitely will have to incline to agree with you.
Hmm. Hurricane Alton Ebron says, will the Gulf of Mexico get more hurricanes in October and November? A bit too early to say that for sure, but I would say going into October, watch the areas off towards the western part of this basin. I'll circle the areas that we generally need to watch going into October. I think we generally need to watch areas in the Caribbean Sea, especially the Gulf of Mexico as well, and maybe along the coastline of Mexico here in the Eastern Pacific, especially because October is notorious in the Eastern Pacific for a recurvature season, and that is when you have a storm form down here in the Eastern Pacific and recurve into the coastline of Mexico. We've had a few storms do this. Patricia is one that immediately comes to mind. We also have, last year we had Rosalind do it, and we had Orlean do it a little bit early. So watch these areas in the western part of the Atlantic Basin and the eastern part of the Eastern Pacific for tropical cyclone development heading into October and maybe extending into November. We'll have to wait and see on that. November is still more than a month away, a month and a half away until we get to November, so there is still a lot that can change regarding November.
I know the Gulf of Mexico, interestingly enough here, there is expected to be a pretty strong subtropical jet that's basically going to be ejecting into the United States and along the continental United States, basically going into the next month or so here as the mid to upper level air patterns are going to be changing with the jet stream. That subtropical jet could potentially increase some wind shear in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not sure if you agree with this here, Ethan, but definitely could be some increased wind shear. However, regardless of that, for the time being, it's right now. The conditions in the Gulf of Mexico are, to put into perspective, primed with some very, very warm, very warm sea surface temperatures, although that might have been a little bit dilated due to Adalia as well as basically just Adalia. So the Gulf is still warming up in terms of its sea surface temperatures and overall ocean temperatures. However, definitely we'll keep an eye out for the Gulf of Mexico as well as the area you highlighted there, as it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens as we head into October and in the more extended long range into November, basically towards the typical end of the season.
Absolutely. We have gotten a few questions here. Where was it? What are we expecting in terms of impacts in New Brunswick? I think New Brunswick is going to get strong tropical storm force winds, sustained winds, especially along the southern side of the coastline there. Of course, there's always the threat of heavy rainfall and maybe some embedded tornadoes within this system as well. There's always those risks that come with these kind of systems as they move up into land areas. So those are certainly going to be some threats. But once again, this isn't really going to be a long duration event. This is maybe going to be a 24-hour. This is going to be an event that's going to be limited to within 24 hours, I think. Even though this is going to be a large storm, as it comes up into Canada, its movement speed is going to be increasing throughout the forecast period. So I think that as the system moves inland, impacts are going to be, of course, you're going to get heavy rainfall, you're going to get the strong winds, and they're going to be for a few hours, of course, because this is going to be a large storm. But once the storm moves quickly off towards the northeast and back into the tropical Atlantic after it does what it needs to do over Canada, the impacts will lessen quite quickly. Because a lot of this is on the northern side of the circulation. You'll notice on the satellite imagery here, the southern end of the storm really isn't as heavy as the convection heavy, I should say, as the northern side is, which I think is pretty interesting.
Speaking of a little tidbit here that I believe you responded to that question there about the tornado as well as heavy rainfall guidance. The SPC does actually note that potential for severe thunderstorms will likely be limited with the direct influence of Lee This is basically owing due to the fact that there's going to be dry air advection from Tropical Cyclone Lee having influence on basically the quality of moisture return as well as destabilization potential for the portions of the mid-Atlantic states on Sunday. This is likely also going to be due to some cloud cover that's probably going to develop as well. So the tornado threat, as well as isolated severe weather threat, is likely to be limited. Therefore, as such, I don't think SPC will be issuing bulletins or perhaps even outlooks. However, if they are going to issue potential severe risks, I think the absolute maximum that they will likely issue is going to be a probably low end marginal risk. However, I don't even think it's going to really get to that point, given the fact that those concerns pointed out by SPC are definitely real concerns and are legit, basically fail modes. And the system overall and its orientation really doesn't scream tornadoes as well as severe weather to me. It really just screams the extensive wind field, expanding the wind threat, as well as the storm surge, coastal flooding, as well as heavy rain, flash flooding threat. Not really going to be seeing a whole lot in terms of the severe weather side of things from the system. However, regardless of that, you cannot limit out the potential for tropical tornadoes with this particular system, as we've seen with storms like the likes of Dahlia, Ian of last year. We also have seen this with very infamous tropical cyclones, including Ida, even other systems to name here in the Atlantic Basin. Regardless of the storm and its overall orientation, you definitely cannot rule out something that could happen, although I'm not really going to be expecting too much. But the chance is not zero. It just is, in my opinion, very, very, very low.
Going back to the National Hurricane Center's forecast cone, you can see those watches and warnings do continue. Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, as well as a tropical storm watch, which is in effect from New Brunswick to the north of Point Lepreau to Port Lawrence. Nova Scotia west coast from north of Digby to Fort Lawrence, as well as Nova Scotia's southeast coast from north of Medway Harbor to Point Tupper. So that is what we're seeing with the watches and warnings in effect right now, as of course, stay tuned to your local media office and the official management agency, whether it be the National Weather Service or Emergency Management in Canada, I believe is what it's called. Correct me if I'm wrong with that. I do apologize if I did get that correct. That is what we are seeing with the watches and warnings, and stay tuned to the officials for the latest information regarding this extremely dangerous storm. Just because it is coming in as a Category 1 hurricane and weakening into a tropical storm or a post-tropical cyclone does not mean that the threat is lessening. We do have a few questions here. What is a post-tropical cyclone? I think, Patrick, you'd be personally in a better spot to answer that than I would be, personally.
So basically a post-tropical cyclone, it is a tropical cyclone that basically lacks deep, robust convection near the center of circulation. It is also typically associated with more frontal systems. I really don't have an exact definition to provide. However, basically, what you want to look for in a post-tropical cyclone is a lack of deep, robust convection near the center or the low-level circulation. You also want to look at how the storm is oriented. You can see that Lee has a quote-unquote very massive and elongated banding, probably in association with a frontal system that is likely picking up to the storm right now. And you just see, Ethan, right in the center, just how absolutely disheveled it looks. Still an intense storm, likely due to some very low pressure that the recon is still finding, but you can definitely see that there is not a lot of robust convection at all persisting with this system near that center. And basically, post-tropical cyclones, they are not tropical, so therefore they're not. You really don't see the key characteristics in a tropical cyclone, which is, like I said, robust deep convection that embeds the low level circulation, strong convective banding, which basically wraps around the system. And the banding is typically not elongated and basically oriented to the north like you see with Lee. It typically is wrapped around more tighter and basically is more connected to the system
and is directly influenced by the system, not directly influenced by other frontal systems or other non-tropical cyclone slash frontal systems. Basically, to put it in simplest terms, a post-tropical cyclone is not a tropical related cyclone. However, regardless of the designation, if it's post-tropical, it's tropical. It still is a cyclone of potentially significant nature and is a large and powerful system. 85 miles per hour, 956 millibars is what NHC as well as us are currently running with right now. Lee is expected to remain a powerful system, perhaps even a very large system, or likely is going to be still a very large system, likely will continue to even grow in size, and will bring impacts to Atlantic Canada as well as potentially even the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because that this storm is weakening, as I just said, into tropical storm status as it turns post-tropical does not mean that this system is, the threat level is going down. The system is going to become a very large storm. Its wind field is going to get larger as it pushes off towards the north, and impacts will extend well outside of the forecast cone and could extend as far west as interior Rhode Island. Going back over to the National Hurricane Center's key messages, this is the first time that we've seen it. They do say tropical storm oh, excuse me there. Tropical storm conditions, heavy rainfall, and high surf will continue to impact Bermuda through Friday morning, and tropical storm warning continues. Hurricane conditions and coastal flooding are possible in portions of eastern Maine, southern New Brunswick, and western Nova Scotia on Saturday, and a hurricane watch is in effect for those regions. Tropical storm conditions and coastal flooding are expected to begin in southern New England on Friday afternoon and spread northward along the coast of New England through Saturday, where tropical storm warnings are in effect. Heavy rainfall from Lee may produce localized urban and small stream flooding across eastern New England and into portions of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia from Friday night into Saturday night and beyond. Patrick, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly point out here, just a general comment here. Don't underestimate Lee. Simple as that. This storm is likely to be significant in nature. I know someone pointed out in the chat. We must not underestimate storms. Yes, absolutely. Regardless of the size, intensity, and strength of Lee, it is to be noted here that you cannot, and I mean under any circumstance, you cannot underestimate this storm at all. You need to prepare for the worst, but hope for the absolute best. And basically keeping that in mind and rushing your preparations to completion, you will likely have a much more better response time as well as overall general response to this particularly dangerous storm.
Absolutely. How much rainfall will Canada get from Lee? We can pull up the latest GFS model run here. It'll just take me just a little bit just to get this up through day 3 here. We'll go up to regarding Lee. We'll actually go a little bit beyond that through day 5, just that way we can get the whole scope of rainfall for this storm. So here is what we are seeing right now with the rainfall threat. You can see obviously we have the highest totals here down in the red and pink remaining far offshore, which is some really good news. But you'll see here the highest inland rainfall that we're seeing, maybe up towards 4 inches maximum, and that's maximum totals. So obviously these are very mountainous areas, so it will not take a lot of rainfall to cause landslides and mudslides in these regions, but still, these rainfalls, I have to say, are lower than what I was expecting to see. That's really some good news, though, for these regions, of course.
It absolutely is. I just want to make a quick comment real quick before we get off from here. I saw a comment earlier said, man, that the tropics have really been kind of active this year. I want to kind of give an idea, just show like how remarkable. I said this earlier that for an El Nino year, we're experiencing a relatively historic hurricane season. We're already up to 100 accumulated cyclone energy. Well, the overall average for Atlantic seasons, as they've been studied from 1991 to 2020, the average is 14 named storms. While we haven't had 14 named storms, we've had 13 named storms, and of course we had that unnamed subtropical storm earlier this year. So we have had 14 storms. So we've already here, we're sitting halfway through September, and we've hit the average for tropical storms this year. The hurricane average is around 7 a year. You typically hit the 7th one about November 15th. We're sitting at 5 right now, so we're a little ahead of schedule for that. You see the I don't know if you have my thing up right now. Yeah, you do. So the 5th one usually happens around September 28th, and so we're a couple weeks ahead of time on that one right now, and we've already hit our quota for the average of major hurricanes this year. October 28th, usually the last one that happens, at least in the Atlantic Ocean, and so we're sitting at an average season for named storms, an average season for major hurricanes, and we're on our way to an average year for hurricanes, and it's only September. Interesting, you betcha. Here's what's the Pacific averages look like, just to kind of get an idea with this as well. The average is about 15 each year, and right now we've had 10 named storms in the Pacific Ocean. Average of 8 hurricanes, well, there's been 7 so far. So we're ahead of schedule for the hurricanes in the Pacific, and we've already exceeded the average for major hurricanes in the Pacific. Usually that's 4. We've had 5 already, and of course, potential for Invest 94 to erupt and go severe is going to add to the total of named systems. So far, we've had 10, and you see here the 11th one, September 14th. Hey, here within the next couple of days, that one could be named. That one could be a depression, could be a tropical storm. We're still right on schedule for the named systems over in the Pacific, but that's just a general idea of like the level of activity that's gone on compared to what the averages usually have been over the last 30 years or so. And definitely a couple of interesting seasons we've seen so far. It's been very, very busy so far.
Absolutely. I'm afraid that we're out of time here, unfortunately, to cover Hurricane Lee. I imagine that we'll be producing more video updates on this extremely dangerous hurricane that moves off towards the north into land areas, including New England and Atlantic Canada, over the next 24 to 48 hours, with, I imagine, more live coverage on the way and some potential landfall coverage to come later on down the line on Friday, maybe even into Saturday. Stay tuned to your local emergency office and weather information office, whether that be the United States National Weather Service or Atlantic's, or Canada's, I should say, Emergency Management in Canada. I don't know what it's called over there, unfortunately.
Environment Canada.
Thank you. But stay tuned to your local officials over there for the latest information on Hurricane Lee as it moves off towards the north. Stay safe and have a good night from all of us here at Force 13.
Stay safe, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful evening.